Today we will explore the history of the most enigmatic medieval manuscript the world has ever known. A book written in a language that no one has been able to decipher, filled with illustrations that defy any logical explanation, and which for centuries has resisted the most brilliant minds of humanity. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Sometime between the years 1404 and 1438, someone took sheets of parchment, prepared their ink and began to write. They wrote with care, with intention, with a purpose that only that mind, privileged or disturbed, we will never know, truly understood. The words formed line by line, page by page, and beside them appeared detailed drawings, plants of forms never seen before in any known flora, diagrams of stars and planets organized in circular patterns of surprising elaboration, human figures immersed in structures of strange and inexplicable shapes, and symbols that belonged to no alphabet recorded anywhere in the world. When the last page was filled, the manuscript was complete, and during the following centuries, it would travel through empires and private collections, through monasteries and libraries, crossing borders and generations, without ever revealing its most fundamental secret: what, after all, is written in it. This mysterious document rests today under rigorous care at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, in the United States. It is known worldwide by the name of its most famous modern owner, the Manuscrito Voynich. But its story begins long before Wilfrid Voynich found it in a lot of old books in the year 1912. It begins in centuries of silence, of hands that leafed through it without understanding a single line, of extraordinary minds that tried to penetrate its secrets and were defeated, one after another, by the absolute opacity of its content. To truly understand what makes this manuscript so singular, one must first understand what it is materially. It is a handwritten book with 240 preserved pages, although internal evidence suggests that there were originally more sheets, some of which were lost over the centuries. The material support is high-quality vellum made from animal skin treated with artisanal precision, which allowed its extraordinary survival for more than 600 years. The ink used is of organic origin, consistent with medieval European production methods, and the script that covers its pages from the first to the last is completely unknown. The alphabet of the Manuscrito Voynich, frequently called Voynichese by researchers, consists of approximately 25 distinct characters, although some scholars identify variations that raise this number to 40 or more. These characters appear organized into words. The words group into sentences, the sentences form paragraphs, and the paragraphs fill entire pages with a regularity that suggests genuine linguistic structure. The text flows from left to right, with clear margins and an organized appearance that does not suggest improvisation or random writing. Whoever wrote it, wrote with the confidence of someone who perfectly knew what they were recording, of someone for whom those marks had a precise and incontestable meaning. The illustrations that accompany the text divide the manuscript into distinct thematic sections, each with its own visual characteristics and its own specific enigmas. The first large section is called by researchers the botanical section, and it contains more than 100 images of plants. The fundamental problem with these illustrations is that the vast majority of the represented plants do not correspond to any known plant species. Botanists and specialists in medieval flora analyzed each of these images meticulously and reached a conclusion that defies common sense. Although some images may superficially evoke certain real plants, the details are consistently strange, modified, or simply invented. Roots that grow in directions that botany does not predict, flowers with geometries that no known plant produces, leaves arranged in patterns that nature does not repeat on any continent. The second prominent section is referred to by scholars as the astronomical or astrological section. Here the manuscript displays circular diagrams reminiscent of medieval celestial maps, with representations of the sun, the moon, stars, and constellations. Some of these images seem to show the signs of the zodiac, but in versions slightly different from the traditional European ones, with variations that do not fit into any documented astrological system. Others seem to represent planetary systems or maps of the cosmos, organized according to a logic that modern astrophysicists and historians of science have been unable to fit into any known astronomical system of the Middle Ages or any other period before or after. Perhaps the most disturbing section of the manuscript is the one researchers call the biological section. In it, numerous human figures appear immersed in elaborate structures, interconnected by tubes and channels that vaguely resemble some type of distribution or processing system. The figures are predominantly female and appear in positions that suggest some kind of process or ritual, but the exact context remains completely obscure. There is a quality both methodical and surreal in these images, as if they represented some medical, philosophical, or mystical system whose conceptual foundations have been completely lost in time, leading any attempt at interpretation to a stalemate. The manuscript also contains sections that researchers categorize as pharmaceutical and recipe-based, with images of containers, jars, and what appear to be ingredients or preparations of some kind. And there is also a final section, composed entirely of text without illustrations, organized into carefully delimited paragraphs, a fact that suggests the text was important enough to exist without visual support, which has led some researchers to theorize that perhaps this section contains the interpretative keys to all the rest of the manuscript. To understand how this book reached us, it is necessary to take a journey back in time to the 17th century, to the heart of the Holy Roman Empire. The city of Prague, capital of the vast Habsburg domain, was at that time one of the most vibrant intellectual centers in all of Europe. And at the center of this cultural and scientific ferment was Emperor Rodolfo II, a monarch who combined, in equal proportions, political ambition and an obsessive passion for occult knowledge, natural sciences, and the curiosities of the world that defied conventional classification. Rodolfo II was a compulsive collector of rarities. His Kunstkammer, the imperial cabinet of curiosities, housed extraordinary fossils, state-of-the-art scientific instruments for the time, priceless works of art, and objects that defied any attempt at systematic classification. And it was in this environment of fascination for the rare and the inexplicable that the manuscript first appeared in historical records with some documentary solidity. According to a letter discovered centuries later, Rodolfo II allegedly acquired the manuscript for a considerable sum, 600 gold ducats, a fortune that clearly indicated how much the emperor valued the mysterious volume and what he hoped to find in its pages. But who sold the manuscript to Rodolfo II, and where did the book come from before that? These questions remain without a definitive answer to this day. There are speculations, and there are names that emerge in historical investigations with certain recurrence, each bringing with it an additional layer of mystery. One of these names is that of John Dee, the famous mathematician, astrologer and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I of England, who visited the court of Prague at the end of the 16th century and was known for collecting rare manuscripts and for his interest in the limits of human knowledge. Another name frequently mentioned is that of his collaborator, Edward Kelly, who claimed to receive messages in languages he considered to be of celestial origin, languages that, for some enthusiastic researchers, could have some conceptual connection with the script of the Manuscrito Voynich. These connections, however, remain in the realm of speculation and have not been proven by sufficiently solid documentary evidence. What is known with more certainty is that after the death of Rodolfo II in 1612, the manuscript passed through several hands within the intellectual environment of Prague. At some point, it reached the hands of Georg Baresch, a German alchemist who lived in the city in the early 17th century. Baresch spent decades hunched over the manuscript, trying to decipher it without success. The accumulated frustration led him to take an action that revealed both his desperation and his hope. In 1639, he wrote a letter to Athanasius Kircher, a German Jesuit who was considered at the time the greatest polymath in Europe, someone who had studied Egyptian hieroglyphs, Oriental languages, Hermetic philosophy, and practically every field of knowledge available in his time. If anyone in the world was capable of deciphering that manuscript, that someone was Kircher. In the letter, Baresch described the manuscript as a work of medicine or natural philosophy, written in unknown characters, with illustrations of plants that seemed to be of Oriental or New World origin. He sent hand-copied samples of the text, a gesture that demonstrates both the care Barish dedicated to the original and the desperation of one who had consecrated years of his life to an absolutely intractable enigma. The idea was simple. If the samples were enough for Kircher to understand the writing system, the path to decipherment would be open. Kircher, to the surprise of many who followed the intellectual events of the time, was unable to decipher the examples received. But he showed enough interest that, after Barish's death, the manuscript was sent to him through Barish's successor, the rector of the University of Prague, Jan Marci. Along with the manuscript, Marci sent in 1665 a letter that is considered today one of the most important documents in the history of the Voynich. In this letter, Marci mentioned the oral and documentary tradition that the manuscript had belonged to Rodolfo II, and that the emperor believed the author was the English friar Roger Bacon, a 13th-century philosopher and scientist widely considered one of the precursors of the experimental scientific method in medieval Europe. The theory of Roger Bacon as the author of the Manuscrito Voynich endured for centuries and resurfaced with force in the early 20th century. But at that moment, in 1665, the manuscript reached Kircher's hands without the expectation of resolution being fulfilled. The great scholar also could not decipher it. The manuscript was stored in the collection of the Collegio Romano of the Jesuits in Rome, where it remained for more than 2 centuries, relatively forgotten, while the world around it went through scientific, political, and cultural revolutions of unprecedented magnitude. It was then that the year 1912 arrived, and the man who would give his name to the manuscript forever entered the scene. Wilfrid Michael Voynich was a Polish bookseller who had settled in London and specialized in the purchase and sale of rare manuscripts and books from all over Europe. He was a fascinating figure in his own right. He had been imprisoned in Tsarist Russia for revolutionary activities, had escaped to Western Europe, and built from nothing a remarkable career in the trade of intellectual rarities. In 1912, he found himself at the Villa Mondragone in Frascati near Rome, where the Jesuit Collegio Romano had transferred a significant part of its collection following Italian unification and the subsequent confiscation of religious properties by the Italian state. Among the manuscripts available for sale at that villa, Voynich found the mysterious volume. According to his own later account, he immediately recognized that he was facing something absolutely extraordinary, something he had not seen the like of in decades of working with historical documents. He acquired the manuscript, along with other documents from the same lot, and returned to London certain that he had made the discovery of his life. He was not wrong, but he probably did not imagine to what extent that book would consume not only his own existence, but that of entire generations of researchers after him. Voynich photographically reproduced several pages of the manuscript and distributed copies among scholars and experts in cryptography, inviting them to attempt decipherment. It was at this moment that the theory of Roger Bacon resurfaced with renewed strength, largely thanks to Voynich himself, who sincerely believed that the English friar had been the author and that the manuscript contained extraordinary scientific knowledge, far ahead of its time. The theory gained wide circulation in academic circles and the popular press of the time, although the scientific means to test it precisely did not yet exist. The Second World War transformed the field of cryptography irreversibly and produced a set of code-breaking specialists unprecedented in history. Efforts to decipher the coding systems of the Axis powers brought together some of the most brilliant minds of the generation in industrial-scale cryptographic analysis projects. Bletchley Park in England was the epicenter of this effort, and it was there that mathematicians, linguists, and engineers worked together to break codes that seemed impenetrable. After the war ended, some of the world's most experienced cryptographers turned their attention to the Manuscrito Voynich, confident that the techniques that had broken the most sophisticated military coding systems would be more than enough to handle a manuscript from the Middle Ages. They were not. The war cryptographers applied to the Voynich the same statistical frequency analyses, the same methods of searching for repetitive patterns, the same techniques that had worked with overwhelming effectiveness against the most elaborate codes created by human minds in the 20th century, and the manuscript resisted all of them with a kind of indifference that would be comical if it were not so deeply disconcerting. William Friedman, considered the father of modern American cryptology, and one of the greatest code analysis experts in history, dedicated a considerable part of his final years to the Manuscrito Voynich. He gathered a group of experienced colleagues and war veterans, established a systematic study of the text for years, and reached a conclusion that intrigued more than it clarified. The manuscript seemed to contain real language, with the statistical structure of a natural language. But it did not correspond to any known language, nor to any identifiable coding system among all those that had been invented throughout the history of cryptography. This result, the conclusion that the Voynich possesses the statistical properties of a real language without being any known language, is one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire history of this singular object. Because there are basically two major explanations for this phenomenon, and both are deeply disconcerting in their own way. The first is that the manuscript is actually written in a language that is still unknown or extinct today, encoded in an original writing system that has not yet been understood by modern science. The second is that the manuscript is an elaborate forgery, an invented text of extraordinary sophistication, constructed with enough skill to mimic the statistical properties of a real language without actually communicating any genuine content. This second hypothesis gained one of its most articulate defenders in the year 2004, when British researcher Gordon Rugg presented a theory that caused considerable debate in academic circles. Rugg proposed that the manuscript could have been created using a Cardan grill, a simple medieval coding device consisting of a sheet of material with cut-out openings slid over a table of syllables to select combinations of characters. According to Rugg, this method could produce text that appears to have linguistic structure, but actually carries no meaning, and could have been created for a very specific purpose, to deceive a wealthy buyer like Emperor Rodolfo II, convincing him that he was acquiring an esoteric work of enormous intellectual value. Rugg's theory was received with genuine interest, but also with grounded skepticism. Critics pointed out that the Cardan grill mechanism would have difficulty faithfully reproducing specific characteristics of the Voynich text, such as certain regularities in word position within sentences and co-occurrence patterns, that suggest a more elaborate underlying grammar than a simple selection grill could consistently generate over hundreds of pages. While the debate over the manuscript's authenticity or falsity dragged on in academic circles, science advanced with its own investigative tools. In 2009, researchers applied carbon-14 analysis to the parchment of the Manuscrito Voynich, dating the material with a statistically high margin of confidence. The results were clear and definitive in at least one aspect. The parchment was produced between 1404 and 1438, during the early 15th century in Europe. This does not mean that the text was necessarily written at the same time the parchment was manufactured. It is theoretically possible that someone used old material to write in a later period, but this possibility is considered unlikely by most researchers, given that the style of the illustrations is consistent with European art of the indicated time, and that the chemical composition of the ink also seems compatible with that historical period. Carbon-14 dating definitively ruled out the theory of Roger Bacon as the author, since the English friar had passed away around 1292, more than a full century before the date of the parchment's production. With this theory toppled by objective scientific evidence, the question of authorship returned to square one. Who wrote the Manuscrito Voynich in the early 15th century? In what intellectual, religious, or cultural context was this work conceived and executed? And in what language, int or pseudo-language, are its pages written? With the proliferation of personal computers and later the internet, the Manuscrito Voynich gained a new kind of attention that its medieval owners could never have imagined. Yale University made high-resolution digital images of all its pages available, making the manuscript accessible to anyone in the world with a network connection. This radical democratization of access generated an explosion of theories and decipherment attempts, coming not only from academics with formal credentials in linguistics or cryptography, but from enthusiasts, mathematicians, programmers, and simply the curious from all parts of the globe, each bringing perspectives that conventional specialists did not necessarily possess. The digital age brought new tools to an old enigma. Pattern recognition algorithms, statistical text analysis programs, artificial neural networks, and natural language processing techniques were all employed in the attempt to decode Voynich-Kazi. The results were fascinating from a technical point of view, but frustrating from the standpoint of effective decipherment. The analyses confirmed what human cryptographers had already observed. The Voynich text possesses statistical characteristics consistent with natural language, including word frequency distributions that follow Zipf's law, the mathematical law that describes usage patterns in natural human languages. At the same time, the Voynich text possesses peculiarities unparalleled in any known natural language. Certain words appear almost exclusively at the beginning of lines, others almost exclusively at the end. Identical words rarely appear in sequence, something that occurs frequently in natural languages, but is notably rare in Voynich-Kazi. And certain combinations of characters that would be expected in any language with the apparent structure of Voynich-Kazi simply never appear, while other combinations appear with disproportionate frequency. These are anomalies that fit comfortably, neither with the hypothesis that it is a genuine language, nor with the hypothesis that it is randomly generated text. While 21st century researchers pored over the manuscript with increasingly sophisticated computational tools, a curious parallelism developed in cultural circles. The Manuscrito Voynich itself became a phenomenon that transcended the limits of academia. Fiction novels, films, video games, and television series make reference to it. Online communities dedicated exclusively to its analysis bring together members from dozens of countries in passionate debates over every detail of its pages. It has entered the collective imagination as the ultimate symbol of intellectual mystery, of knowledge that resists being reached regardless of how much effort is applied to it. This has its own historical irony when one thinks about it. A book that was created presumably to be read, whether as a medical treatise, a philosophical manual, an alchemical compendium, or a work of ritual esotericism, became famous precisely for not being able to be read. Its illegibility is now its most well-known and culturally valued characteristic. Thinking about the centuries this manuscript has crossed is an experience capable of producing a particular kind of historical vertigo. It existed while the Gutenberg press was revolutionizing the production of texts in Europe and forever transforming the human relationship with written knowledge. It was on some shelf or in some chest, while Columbus crossed the Atlantic and the European world expanded its understanding of the globe in an irreversible way. It survived the religious wars that devastated Central Europe in the 17th century, probably because it had been kept with enough care to resist the turmoil. It passed through the Enlightenment without being enlightened. It crossed the Industrial Revolution without being industrially reproduced. And it arrived in the 21st century, the age of information and artificial intelligence, remaining exactly as mysterious as it had been on the day its last line was written. There is something deeply human in this persistence that the manuscript exhibits through the centuries. It represents perhaps the purest paradox of knowledge, a book that exists to communicate, but that communicates nothing we can understand. A message sent to the future by someone from the past, which the future, our present, has not yet learned to read, despite all the scientific and technological apparatus we have developed. The Beinecker Library catalogues it as MS-408. For specialized researchers, it is the Manuscrito Voynich, or simply the Voynich, with the familiarity of one who spends years studying an object. For the general public, it is the most mysterious book in the world, a title that no other volume seems in a position to seriously dispute. But for whoever created it, in some scriptorium or private chamber in early 15th century Europe, it was simply a work, something worth the time and considerable effort to record, something that deserved to be carefully preserved on quality parchment, something that had enough value to be kept for a lifetime and then passed on, that someone could never have imagined that the work they were creating would become, centuries later, the greatest enigma in the history of human intellectual thought. There is a question that researchers frequently formulate and that well captures the singularity of this situation. If the Manuscrito Voynich is an elaborate forgery, then it is the most sophisticated forgery in medieval history, created by someone with an extraordinary level of linguistic skill, artistic talent, and the patience to produce hundreds of pages of pseudo-text that deceives even the most advanced natural language processing algorithms of the 21st century. And if it is not a forgery, then it is a genuine document written in a language or coding system that 600 years of collective human intellectual effort have not been enough to decipher. In either case, the level of skill and intention involved in its creation is absolutely disconcerting to any mind that reflects on it seriously. Researchers continue their work with a persistence that is itself remarkable. New studies are published regularly, each bringing a new fragment of perspective or a methodological approach different from the previous ones. The scientific community dedicated to the Voynich is small but extraordinarily persistent, driven by a combination of academic rigor and the same fascination that moves any human being before an enigma that seems within reach but repeatedly evades any attempt at apprehension. The Voynich is not an enigma without clues. It is an enigma overflowing with clues that point in all directions simultaneously, without ever converging on a solution that resists critical analysis. Each generation of researchers that approaches the Voynich arrives with the sincere hope that this time, with these tools, and with this new perspective, the solution will be within reach. And each generation discovers that the manuscript guards its secrets with an efficiency that no military code, no diplomatic cipher, and no historical writing system has ever managed to equal. The Manuscript Voynich is also today a document about the process of trying to know, about what it means to face what one does not understand, about the extraordinary persistence that human curiosity is capable of sustaining in the face of obstacles that repeat for decades and centuries without yielding, and about the ever-present possibility, never discarded and never confirmed, that one day someone will finally combine the right knowledge with the right perspective, and the words written on that medieval parchment will finally make sense to a human being for the first time in more than 600 years. And so the Manuscript Voynich continues to exist, in the physical pages resting in New Haven and in the digital images circulating on the internet, waiting with a patience that time does not seem to diminish, waiting for the mind that will finally find the pattern that all other minds did not see, waiting for the algorithm that will transform the characters of Voynichese into understandable words and ideas that can be debated, waiting, perhaps, for the key to its understanding to require a specific combination of historical, linguistic, and scientific knowledge that has not yet gathered in a single analysis, in a single person, in a single moment of illumination. When that happens, if it happens, it will be one of the most extraordinary moments in the intellectual history of humanity, and all that the Manuscript Voynich will reveal then will be what was always there, in the lines that so many minds traveled without understanding, a voice from the past, waiting to be finally heard. If this documentary awakened in you the same fascinating restlessness that the Manuscript Voynich has provoked in researchers around the world for generations, then you already instinctively know what to do. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this journey of discoveries that, just like the pages of the Voynich, is still very far from reaching an end. Leave in the comments what you believe is written on that mysterious parchment. Your theory, however improbable it may seem, might be exactly the perspective that the world has not yet considered. And if this video made you want to continue exploring the mysteries that history has preserved without explanation, the like button is your signal that human curiosity remains alive, remains insatiable, and remains the most powerful force that humanity possesses.